think it's something similar like Cal Poly, where technically it's a horticulture degree.
After meeting the principals involved, I can believe that.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, we thank you for being with us this morning. I know you're busy, but
Enjoyed the break.
yeah. We want to talk a little bit about the history of the landscape contracting program and how it developed here. And I think maybe a good place to start is let's reminisce a little bit back years ago. Tell us a little bit about when you came here and under what conditions and that sort of thing. I think that'll sort of set the scenario to go forward.
Jim, I had been in business for about 12 or 15 years in a garden center and opened a service business in Jackson that we call the Horticulture Center, which was really a consulting and service firm. And I had hired the technical degreed people. At one time I had a horticulturist, a landscape architect, and an agronomist working with me. And I had dropped out of Millsaps at 19, liberal arts college, and one weekend, the landscape architect resigned and the agronomist died, literally in my arms, of a heart attack. Mm. And I came home and my wife said, if you're going to stay in this crazy business, you've got to go get the degrees. And so that meant Mississippi State. So at 37, we packed up bag and baggage and a 3- and a 5-year-old and came back to college. Clyde Singletary, who was then the head of the horticulture department, now my degree is in horticulture and that's what I came here for, was very supportive. And he had the entire staff in one Saturday morning to review my transcript, if you can believe that. And Clyde knew what I was here for, and so he suggested a degree in landscape contracting. There was no such thing. And it soon became apparent that their concept of landscape contracting and mine was not the same either. It was basically a slight modification of a horticulture degree. But I guess maybe that's where the seed was planted, was that the leadership in the horticulture department close to 30 years ago recognized that there was, as he said, a void between the professional landscape architect, the horticulturist, the nurseryman installing the plants. And that's what they saw a landscape contractor doing, basically, was installing plants. And that's why I say that our viewpoints diverged significantly.
Mm-hmm. Now what year was that?
68, I came here as an undergraduate. Took 2.5 years to take the degree, and I think the contracting program technically started in the fall of 71.
And that's actually when you went on staff to begin developing the...
Well, I went on staff as
horticulture.
Yeah, I was hired as a student worker to work in the campus grounds department. And that's what they wanted me to do, and that's what I did. That's what paid my salary. I recall Dr. Singletary, and I'll refer to him as Clyde, no disrespect, but we became very close friends as well as he was my boss. Clyde asked me 3 times to take this job heading campus landscape. Ed Martin then was doing it half-time, and Ed had requested going back to teaching full-time. Mm-hmm. And Clyde didn't know what to do with it. But I'd worked as a student worker, and he had seen that we'd gotten production by using some methods that were used for years in industry, but somehow they escaped the university. Yeah. And so about the 3rd go-round, he took me over to Dr. Wise's office. And I had been, in all candor, critical of some of the things in the horticulture department, of primarily telling students that they were preparing them to go out and succeed in industry, and I just knew that wasn't, not right out of college anyway. Mm-hmm. And Lewis kind of, as only Lewis Wise can do, he lowered and squinted and he says, Bob, he said, we know we're not preparing people for industry. He says, why don't you stay here and show us how? And that, I guess, really planted the seed, yeah, that there might be some changes that could be made.
Well, it's interesting. At that time, I think there was a lot of discussion in university systems all over the country, and here we have the basic concept of liberal education, in this case horticulture, mixed in as a very scientific education. The industry, on the other hand, exploding, the vast amount of knowledge requiring a lot more further training, and some of the things not being addressed. I think that was typical of a lot of places and a lot of other disciplines as well. From that point, how did you come to clarity about landscape contracting as a separate degree? Because this, I'm sure it was debated back and forth whether it would be an option of study in horticulture, whether that would be the right place to house it, or at some point you had to go forward and say, let's get some clarity and to actually develop a curriculum and show the justification for it to get it approved. So let's zero in there and have your thoughts on what was going on.
Clyde Singletary allowed it to happen. Lewis Wise opened the doors for it to happen. It was Bob Chapin's insightfulness that guided it to happen. I was simply the two.
Before we go any further, let's clarify Bob Chapin.
Bob Chapin was the coordinator of landscape architecture, which was in the Department of Horticulture at that time. When Dr. Singletary asked me to assume the coordinatorship of campus landscape, we in effect had an informal trade. I would if he'd let me do other things. And of course what I did was history. I hired Charlie Scoggins and taught him all that I knew at campus landscape, and Charlie did a much better job of it than I did, and that freed me then to work in the academic area, which is what my real desire was. You'd have to know Bob Chapin and know him well to know how his mind works. I thought that we'd get the catalog and we'd pull out some courses and put them together and say this is landscape contracting. Mm-hmm. I guess that my relationships with Dr. Singletary came into play. It was different. I can't explain to you how it was, but we could take the gloves off and fight like a couple of cats and then walk out of the coffee room, and it was just totally, and I've never been around anybody like that I could have that. And so there were no holds barred. And I just let him know what my feeling was about the horticulture program. It was training scientists and research people, and it was not related to industry at all, even to greenhouse management and garden center management, which they're purporting to, and certainly not landscape contracting. So he literally turned it over to myself and Bob Chapin in the division of landscape architecture, and it would be not an option of landscape architecture, but it would be administered under the division of landscape architecture as a separate curriculum, and that decision was made from the beginning. It did not evolve.
That was the point where you actually made the departure out of horticulture department?
No, we were in the horticulture department until LA gained accreditation, and LA became a separate department. At that point, they didn't know again what to do with contracting, and the decision was that it go with LA. That was an administrative decision because I was wearing at the time 3 hats. I was running the flower shop, I was in the academic areas, landscape contracting, and I was coordinator of campus landscape. But back to the evolution of the program, Bob Chapin said, let's define what a landscape contractor is and what one does and what they need to prepare them. And so we basically wrote a definition of a landscape contractor, and it appears in some of the university literature and publications. A landscape contractor is a business person. That was the first decision. They're a business person who installs the work of landscape architects. And this consists of what the industry calls hard construction, decks, irrigation systems, retaining walls, pools, gazebos, cabanas, and they install plant materials and they maintain same. And basically that was, and if you look at the curriculum, it basically reflects that balance of having to understand, and Bob introduced this, having to understand the design if you're going to install it, because his background had been as a landscape architect attempting to get his projects installed, was that contractors would bastardize it, just totally
not understand
where
the design concept was coming from.
And so that was his contribution, was that we were going to have enough design and
for understanding and clarity.
Right. And most of his professors wanted it taught as a separate little section over here for landscape. And Bob says, no, we're going to put them right in there and let them rub elbows with the LAs for 2 years, and they'll develop an understanding and an appreciation of each other and where they're coming from. And to me, that was one of the singular philosophical decisions, theoretical decisions that was made that helped the program.
And it's definitely continued to help it,
I
but
think
still
so.
hotly debated.
Oh, I'm sure it is. It has
Especially
been.
among some landscape architect schools.
And I can understand their viewpoint.
Yes.
I was blasphemed for defending it by the staff almost universally. At one time we had 3 professors and Bob Chapin, and all 3 of them were diametrically opposed to it. Well, you know Mr. Chapin well enough, that didn't do anything but just fuel his fire. He was determined that it was going to be the way that he thought it should be.
Sure. What time frame was that now? Trying to think, the move which separated landscape architecture as a separate department came, of course, with accreditation from ASLA.
I believe 75, Jim.
About 75,
I'm not sure,
so.
but there was a provisional accreditation and then there was a 5-year accreditation.
Yes.
And the recommendation at the 5-year interim was that it become a separate department. And again, Lewis Wise said, well, if that's what the professionals think, then that's what we'll do. And they literally didn't know what to do with contracting, because I think some of the staff, again, would like to have just seen it kind of waste away on the vine and die, and this looked like a good opportunity. But the decision was made that it would go with landscape architecture. And we moved over to Briscoe Hall and began to cut the ties with horticulture.
Now, what input do we have, or did you have from the ALCA leadership in that curriculum? I know that you and Bob Chapin actually sort of had to put something together as a point of departure, but I know also you had some input from some national leaders.
None, actually, at the beginning, at the inception. Believe it or not, we did not know ALCA existed. My background had been in the American Association of Nurserymen. I had been a governor from Mississippi. I was a national retail chairman. Bob Lutter, who was the exec, had wanted me to go into the hierarchy and the ascendancy to the throne as president of AAN, and I was pretty much an active person in the national and the National Landscape Association, of which I also had been a member, which is basically nurserymen who install plant materials, if I may make a differential between that and ALCA. Was then a part of AAN under their umbrella management concept. And so I wrote to Bob Lederer, who was the executive director of AAN, and told him what we proposed to do, and we would like their blessings, their input. Our students were going to need a home. The horticulture students had the American Society of Horticultural Science, the agronomy students had theirs, the landscape architecture students had the American Society of Landscape Architects. Our students didn't have anybody. And he wrote me a real nice letter, and he said, you know, we've thought about this, and our education committee has decided that we need to put our efforts into the 2-year schools. That's where we need to draw our academic strength, and we've kind of put the 4-year program on the back burner. And I couldn't argue with that, because having been an industry person, I knew that what I needed was working foremen and field supervisors. And 2 students, George Smith and, oh goodness, they saw that ALCA was having a national convention in New Orleans, and they wanted to go to New Orleans, and this was a good excuse to go. Here was a national group of landscape contractors meeting down there, and they brought the catalog of the trade magazine clipping to me. And I wrote to them, but it did not get back before the meeting.
I see.
And so no one went to that meeting. But I was contacted later by Jerry Lankenow,
yes,
a former president of ALCA, and we invited Jerry to come down and look us over. And he flew down in his little beach Bonanza. I remember meeting him out here at the airport, and Jerry spent 3 days here. And he did as thorough a job of analyzing what we were doing. He took it textbook by textbook, course by course, talked to the professors. What are you teaching? What do you want to get to the students in this course? Literally to that extent. And when he got through, he took the whole thing back and ran it by their past president's committee, which is going back either 5 or 7 years. And he put together a very comprehensive survey form, telling them what he had found and did they suggest any changes. And then he summarized the changes from the past president's committee. Then he came back with 4 recommended changes. And by the way, they all consisted of basically dropping horticulture courses and adding more business courses. And that went down pretty hard in the department.
I'm sure it did. Yeah,
but Lewis Wise again says, well, let's do it. And it just knocked ALCA's socks off. They could not comprehend that here was an academic institution that would be that receptive to industry input. They at the time had had a committee at Penn State for 7 years attempting to formulate a landscape contracting program. The committee consisted of the head of agronomy, horticulture, and landscape architect. Well, you and I both know that committee is going to form a camel.
Yeah.
And they continued to work for many, many years. But that is how ALCA's input came. It was after the fact. It did modify and it did substantiate what we were doing, but they were not in the initial formative stage. I guess the initial formative stages came across a table just like this between Bob Chapin and Bob Callaway, basically, after the university had made the decision to go.
What battles did you have to fight with the curriculum and putting it through the University Curriculum Committee? Was that any major problem?
Amazingly none.
I think that's because we basically maintained the integrity of the liberal arts core, liberal education core that has always been so strong of it.
Jim, if it was at the time, I wasn't aware. The battles were all internally within the department. And Clyde Singletary was tested on a couple of occasions, and our friendship was tested when the lobbying within the department was for more horticultural science courses. And he overruled me, I think, on one occasion. And I remember we were having a cup of coffee today, and I said, if you take out one more business course and put in one more horticulture course, you can have your bleep curriculum, and I'm leaving here and going back into industry. And that's the only time I really talked to him like that. But I wanted him to understand that his understanding of the program and industries and so forth was not. And I guess unknown at the time, we took a marketing philosophy in developing the curriculum rather than a sales philosophy. A sales philosophy, of course, is I'm going to produce this individual and then let's go see if we can sell it to somebody. We instead, through mine and Bob Chapin's background, knew what we thought industry wanted. And we said, let's see if we can create that item. And then when we got ALCA's input into it, and it both confirmed and substantiated and further developed and pulled away from the university's horticultural concept of what that entity was, I guess the rest was just left to time and history, plus the co-op input.
Yes, and we need to talk about that a little bit there. So by this time we have curriculum in place, and we have ALCA, discovery, so forth of the curriculum. And
didn't know Mississippi State existed, this little country school down here in the South that had suddenly just made a quantum leap over Michigan State and Penn State and all of these other prestigious institutions that they'd been trying to work with.
But that support was just instantaneously there from ALCA once they recognized what you had in that curriculum. When did the accreditation of that program begin, and was it shortly after that they decided to come in and take a look?
During my tenure, there was no accreditation. In fact, the leadership of ALCA was very emphatic. They did not even want to use that verbiage. They approved our program. They endorsed our program. And it was an ongoing thing, mainly when we would go to them. They had no formal body for it. I became an ex officio member of ALCA's board of directors. I was invited to be there. I attended their board meetings. I was welcomed with open arms. I got the opportunity to make a report on Mississippi State and what we were doing at every board meeting, at the annual meetings. I got to give a sales pitch at the business meetings. Would go on for 10 or 15 minutes. First year, they paid the expenses of 5 students to come to San Antonio and introduced them before the annual membership, and had each of them to stand up and take 5 minutes to tell who they were and what their goals and so forth in industry were. We were just like a brand new toy that they had just discovered at that time.
Pretty amazing.
I had no illusions. What they did was they wanted to use us as an example. They wanted to say to Penn State, this is what we want and this is how you do it, and to Michigan State. And 5 or 10 years later, I was invited to Penn State and met with their committee, which is another story. And
we'll tell that story, because I think it's appropriate now of that background, because Penn State is currently started this year with their program.
Their leadership consisted of a horticultural leader who I think his degree was in some phase of bean breeding, and the agronomy who was a microscientist or something, and the landscape architect later became president of LA, and I told him, I said, if you want to have a program, put it in landscape architecture, because it was obvious the other two really had no concept. And that started a discussion that bordered on being a Donnybrook. Horticulture wanted it in horticulture, but what they really wanted is they wanted the head count. They wanted the noses to count for
numbers.
And after about an hour and a half, the ALCA members were there just kind of shaking their head, and I was having fun, really, just being there and
Calling
answering
like
questions. Yeah. And their dean took me aside, and he says, Bob, we won't get there. He said, your administration is 10 years ahead of where ours is. Says, we don't even understand what you're saying. Apparently there's been a change in leadership, or recognizing the inevitable. I understand now that there is a program there, and that's good, because they had all the resources. One of the things was the business school says no, not now, not ever. We will not allow an ag student to take courses in our business school with our business majors. And I could not believe that. They said, we'll put a little separate section over here in kind of an introduction to accounting they can take, but they're not going to take accounting with accounting majors.
It's amazing how difficult new ideas, what difficulty new ideas.
And I realized how that the
sometimes.
dual degree program here, and the dual degree program is really what opened the door here. You know, you can get a degree in business and a degree in agriculture, a degree in engineering and a degree in business. So our business school and the dean that we had at the time, he was just totally receptive. He turned it over to his associate, and I'd just go over there with him and I'd say, how about this? And he said, yeah, that's fine. Said, better not get over 30 hours. Said if you get over 30 hours, we've got to class them as a major. But says 30 hours or less, they can major in anything they want to in the university. So that was the only guideline, was 30 hours or less of business. And at one time, the curriculum was almost a total balance between landscape architectural design, business, liberal arts, horticulture, and construction courses and courses that I taught, which we call the contracting core. So that, and that pretty well followed our definition of what a landscape contractor was.
Then, of course, after that, the other schools began to pick up with the idea and move in developing their programs. And, of course, you know that that curriculum which you developed has been the prototype and the model used.
That's because of ALCA's stamp. They said,
yes,
put it in like this or we won't endorse it.
Yes.
The male fist.
Yes. And that's quite significant, I think. Very, very few of the programs depart a great deal from that basic program there. And it's changed very little to date. We haven't added a whole lot to it. I remember coming here in '71 and being involved with you in some of those lean years with few students and trying to make sure they had jobs and that sort of thing. One thing that we definitely had an advantage of here was the fact that we had a cooperative education program. Talk about that and tell us how you got involved in it.
Yeah, the students that currently are here will never believe what we went through those first years. I was from Jackson. I had had a business in Jackson for 15 years, had a good reputation. I had a good association with my contemporaries there. And John Clifton from Indianola, Harvey Yarborough from Tylertown were the two first students that we recruited. And I sent them down to Jackson to interview with, because we didn't look outside of the state at the time. And the people that they interviewed didn't say no, they said hell no. And they called me and said, don't send me that smart aleck college student that thinks they know all the answers and they don't even know what the questions are. And they got the door slammed in their face and just bent their noses all out of shape. And I had to literally intercede and beg for jobs at minimum wage and said, would you please just take my reputation. If this student does not produce, send them back. Middle of the day, end of the week, whatever. And I weaseled a job for the two of them. John went to work with Hanging Moss Gardens, Bill Basham, who had been the horticulturist at the R&D Center, and he'd left and gone with the LaRue family out there. And John called me up about the second month on the job. He was working for a landscape architectural graduate from here, and he had left to go somewhere, and John had become kind of the unofficial supervisor. And they called him in on Friday and says, well, John, Monday morning you're going to be running the crew. And John calls me and he says, what do I do? He said, I'm running the crew and I can't even read the plans. And I said, well, you go to bed with them and you stay in bed with them this weekend, and by Sunday, if you can't read them, I said, you call me and I'll come down and we'll go over it together, but we'll decide what we're going to do on Monday morning. Well, that company was back up here the next semester wanting to recruit foremen at $3 or $3.50 an hour. Then minimum wage was $2 or $2 1/4. I can't remember which. And that's how it got started. The students could perform.
Yes.
They could read the plans. They could do what the plan said to do.
Now, that resistance from they didn't want to hire people, is that due to just a new program and they didn't know?
It was due to hiring college graduates that would come out and were looking for a position. Industry had gotten turned off to college graduates.
And part of that, don't you think, was the fact that what we've already addressed, that where they were looking in the traditional horticulture schools that were training people for production, field production, or
research.
to be a research scientist.
Not to be a field supervisor.
Not to be
They knew nothing about the
involved.
dynamics of people management or money management.
I think that's a strong point of the program, with the co-op program, because people go out and see what it's like in the field, and they also have an idea what's going on in the office. So,
Oh, absolutely. It gives that void, which is what we were leading up to, that any program in universities is not. University is different from a technical school. University is for broader base training and is not charged with the technical hands-on application as much as technical schools and so forth. So here we have a situation through cooperative education to have the industry working hand in hand with a academic program to provide that training and field expertise, coupled with university training, which yields somebody that's ready to hit the ground running. And I've heard you talk about it many, many times, that was one of the secret ingredients that really made the program soar after its initial takeoff, because the fact that here we had students that could perform when they graduated.
University degree, and I've made light of it, and I don't really, but university degree will pay off all of your life, your productive life and beyond. And the liberal arts phase, in my judgment, more in the later stages of your career than the beginning stages. I would not take anything for my 3 years at Millsaps College. And the literature courses and the philosophy courses, it has made me a whole person. But it sure didn't get me a job right out of Millsaps, and didn't do anything for me at all in the course that I chose to pursue. And industry is short-sighted. They've got to be. I mean, what can you produce for me tomorrow? They're not in the research business that leads to long-term benefits. They've got to look at short-term payback. The co-op program, Jim, and we've alluded to this, is probably the other flip side of the coin of what made this program unique and what really made it soar with industry. I was an undergraduate here at 37, sitting in class with 70-odd students then in horticulture. And I had picked out 4 of them that I would like to hire and take back in industry with me. And I said, the rest of you can go play and practice on somebody else. And they were all 4 co-op students. I can still remember their names today. I won't call them, but and I didn't know a thing about co-op, but they were different. They asked different questions. They challenged the professor when they got to teaching from what I call the yellow note syndrome.
Yes.
They wouldn't accept garbage. I mean, they just And so I beat a path over to the co-op office to find out what this was, and that began a lifelong association with Luther Epting, now the director of the program. He was the associate director at the time. So that combined with a balanced curriculum, I give equal weight to Mississippi State gaining national recognition for the contracting program. And the fact that you have a fine, intelligent young man here from New York down here in your program today, I mean, that's, why was that? What made that?
Let's talk about that. We call the New York connection that developed over the years. What we're alluding to here is the fact that eventually, and to the present date, 60% of the students on the average through the years have been students from out of state. They come here from all over the United States to study in this program. What broke the ice there? Where did that?
Well, there again, you've got to go back to the very inception. Jerry Murdoch, Executive Vice President of the Alfred E. Simpson Company in Atlanta, was at that first ALCA meeting when Jerry Lankenow went back and gave his report. And Jerry was never one to let grass grow under his feet. So the next day he called me, wanted to come over. And he came over and brought his boss, Alfred Simpson. And they made a little presentation and recruited hard. We got the entire curriculum together, command performance. And when Al heard about the co-op program, that was all he wanted to hear about. He hired Larry Wooten. Larry was an unusual student, Vietnam veteran, older, came from Holmes Junior College out of a 2-year building technology program, which fed us students for a number of years, as long as Bob Irby was the head of it down there. He's now the vice president. But I remember Al, about a month into the semester, I called him and I said, "How's Larry doing?" And he said, "Well," he said, "I put him out on a job and I gave him his tools and told him where his suppliers were, and I told him to call me when he needed me." And said I hadn't heard from him, so I thought I'd better go check on him. And so I got out there and said he darn near got the job completed. It was a fence, a deck, a waterfall, all the construction elements that Larry had studied really at Holmes Junior College and had actually worked in as a carpenter. And Al says, "I've got supervisors been with me 15 years and they can't do that good." And so he told Carl McCord at the next ALCA meeting, and Carl's Landscape Design and Construction in Dallas, and Maintain Incorporated, and Carl calls me up and wants to come over and present a seminar. He's a little more sophisticated than Al. Al came over and did a hard sell on recruiting. And so Carl takes an hour and gives a seminar on some bidding and estimating or costing, and he just wowed the students with it, with all the numbers. But it did us a favor because it made them say, "Hey, don't memorize your way through accounting. You're going to use this accounting."
Sure.
And Carl hired John Clifton. And at the time, we not only allowed, but we encouraged the students to change employers, which was a mistake. We didn't know it at the time, but at least I thought it was.
Well, that was allowable in co-op at that time?
Beg your pardon?
That was allowable in co-op at that time?
No, the co-op program has always been one employer, one employee. And I told them, I said, this won't work because all they're going to do is work as a hand on a shovel. And so technically the horticulture department employed them. And they went to work for Campus Landscape, and we worked them one semester at Campus Landscape before I would even let them escape into industry. I was going to see that they had a work ethic and they had common sense, neither of which the university teaches. But if they didn't have those, they weren't going to make it in this industry.
Yeah.
And I knew it was going to be very important, those first students that went out. That lasted about a year, and then industry started recruiting so heavily that we couldn't run them through our little crucible down at Campus Landscape. But that was the advantage I had of wearing two hats. I could ask Charlie, I say, "How many students can you use next semester?" And I'd say, "Well, I've got this many freshmen coming in, and 3 of them on the co-op, can you use them?" John, by then, was about a 3rd-year student or a 4th-year student. And Carl put him on a industrial parks job and basically gave him the budget and told him where to go and rent equipment when he needed it and gave him a crew. And it was about a $125,000 job, and John made him $25,000 profit on that job. And Carl came back the next semester and did a flow chart of the entire job and all of the bidding and estimating and the numbers and so forth, and just blew me away, literally, as to what the student could do before they had even graduated, because I told them you might reach this level by the time you're 3 to 5 years out of the program. And here were junior level co-op students. And they started coming back saying, well, Prof, I ran this $200,000 job during my semester. I said, you did what?
Yeah.
And I realized that the industry was literally bankrupt as far as middle management was concerned. Middle management to me is field supervisory who have hire and fire decision, who have monetary decision-making capacity and so forth. And they were. The industry was literally bankrupt. And that's what they hired the students for. They hired the students to go out and run the jobs in their mind. And then they found out they could read a operating statement, a balance sheet, they could interpret that thing, they understood bottom line management, and they moved up in the industry so much faster than I ever thought that they would. I remember Perry Everett. Perry was from an engineering family, engineers and doctors, and it was a disgrace when he transferred into contracting. And Perry was offered, I think, $10,000 by one firm to stay 2 semesters and run a job that he was into. And when he came back, we all went out, and at that rate's an annual rate. We all went out and celebrated because I had told him it'd take him 2 years out of industry to earn that kind of upkeep. College graduates then were going for $7,200 to $7,800 in those days. And for a co-op student to be earning at the rates of $10,000 a year, putting it in perspective, $10,000 is not much money today. And I'll have to tell this because it did not create any good feelings, but he was in the design studio one day, and one of the LA majors told him, said, man, you're good. You ought to transfer into landscape architecture. And he said, I can't afford to. I can't take the cut in salary. It was those two things. The fact that, hey, here's something that you can enjoy doing and you can make a decent living and you can walk up to the bank and you don't have to be kind of shrinking as if, well, and the fact that industry wanted the product. And so they started sending students. And Bobby Howe came down. I normally knew the out-of-state students before they were coming because industry would contact me. Richie Skelton recruited for years and sent people here. Rich Skelton did. Brickman did. And Bob Howe walked up to registration one fall and says, hey, I'm Bob Howe from Skaneateles, New York, and I'm here to transfer in landscape contract. I said, you're who and what? And he says, I said, who sent you? And he said, Jack Ingalls did. I said, who's Jack Ingalls? He said, well, he's the director at Cobleskill. I said, how'd he know about us? Says, he read about you in a book, an article that somebody wrote. I said, look, I wrote that article and just sent it into the magazine. But Bobby went back to your alumni day, I believe, and said good things about us. And then a little redhead called his name for me.
I know who you're talking about. But
he came down as a walk-on, as a cross-country runner.
Yeah.
And he was a talker.
Yeah. Who Baginski was working for him? Oh, well, we think of it later.
They're on any rate. I'll think of his name in a minute.
What year was this now?
About 70,
76.
whatever. The demand became so great that we created a one-week seminar in the summer for high school and junior college students, and ALCA staffed it. They literally sent students here for us to sell them on coming to Mississippi State. In effect, show them what landscape contracting is. It is not landscape architecture, it's not horticulture, it's a separate discipline, it's a hybrid, if you will. And most of those students were from out of state. And they went back, and then they would bring a roommate back with them. So, and I said, hey, here's a good thing. So when industry would come from out of state, I would say, now look, the cupboard's about bare. We don't have nearly enough students. If you're going to take one, you send one.
Yeah,
and that
good.
became almost a slogan at one time. For whatever reason, Cobleskill, and I think it's because of their culture and their heritage, all their students were going to Georgia at the time and majoring in landscape architecture. And then some of them were going out and becoming landscape contractors, those that had that inclination and bent. And Jack came down and visited twice. Neither time I was here. Michigan State came down. This was kind of became a drop-off point on the spring tour for some schools up through there. And the relationship with Cobleskill has been the longest, the most sustaining, and the most successful, I think, for both parties.
I think so too.
And I hope it still continues. They just last year started a 4-year bachelor's program in landscape contracting.
That was in the mill for a number of years. Some of the people there fought it. They wanted to remain a 2-year, but there have been some good 2-year programs lost by the big syndrome wanting to go to a 4-year school.
Well, I think that's a sign of maturity of the industry, the concept of this program that we've come into it now almost 20 years. It's bound to happen. Other schools, we're going to get severe competition. For a while, we were the only ones doing that. Of course, Oklahoma
I promoted that for years. I told Al, I said, I'll go anywhere. I said, there's no way that one school in the South is going to produce the number of people that this industry needs.
Oh, certainly not.
So I was made chairman of the education committee, and we went and visited Penn State. We visited Oklahoma State, all at Alcoa's expense. It's just that very seldom did we find receptive ears when we got there.
Yes.
We found that.
And I think we're always going to have some problems with new schools starting up. Even at Penn State now, they're not over the hump yet. It did end up in horticulture. Landscape architecture did want it. As I understand it from Neil Porterfield, it's basically administrative decision to put it in agriculture because of declining numbers and so forth. And of course, the landscape architecture department was the one that had promoted it and gotten it all through the committee levels and so forth, so obviously they were upset, but we'll see how that one goes. Let's jump on to one other thing if we have time here, and let's talk a little bit about the Alcoa Field Days and how that started, because you were involved in that, and that has become a major event for the universities and for the association on a national basis. Tell us how that happened.
Field Days just happened. Roy Mecklenburg headed the 2-year program at Michigan State, and we became comrades and brothers. Roy and I would talk almost weekly. I don't know where I met him, but for instance, there would be an economic downturn or upsurge, and he'd call me and he'd say, Bob, he said, our horticulture graduates tell me that there aren't any jobs out there, and said, I'm walking up and down the hall with 12 jobs in my pocket. Are you experiencing this? I said, yeah, I've got more than I can possibly place and so forth. And we talked the same language.
Yes.
Roy, every spring, organized a spring tour for his students, and they would normally wind up Florida or somewhere. And so he called me. And in about 2 days, I organized them a tour through Flowerwood and Bellingrath and New Orleans and so forth. And the students just literally couldn't believe it, that they would have doors open for them. Of course, I was calling in some old contacts from years past with nurserymen. I got them fed a sumptuous meal down in Mobile, and it didn't cost them anything. Got them lodging one night somewhere. So they stopped back by here just to say thank you. And they gave us advance notice they were coming, and so we had the Horticulture Club to host them at a picnic over at Probst Park in Columbus. And there was a camaraderie between the students that developed, and we just spent the day over there, just kibitzing and throwing the frisbee, and I think a spontaneous softball game developed out of it, and Roy and his wife even stayed over an extra day and sent the students on, and they stayed as our guests. I don't know where I first ran into Ron Smith, but Ron was at Ohio State at the time, and he saw, Ron's a very astute person and somewhat opportunistic at times, and he saw what was happening, and he and Davis Sidner got a program started at Ohio State and had the potential to be one of the top programs in the nation. And this kind of developed as a challenge between Roy Mecklenburg and Ron Smith and Bob Callaway. And Michigan State and Ohio State and Mississippi State were going to play it off to see who had the better students. And Mississippi State was chosen because it was in the South and we could do it in the spring. And I said, look, we ought to legitimize this and at least invite a couple of industry people here to act as judges. And so I got in touch with some people. I said, do you think you could send a couple of people down here to serve as judges? And 18 industry people showed up at the first Alcoa Field Day.
At their own expense?
Oh, yes. They registered at student registration. Buck Thrailkill, who was an L.A. major, had a little bluegrass band, and we were out here at the county pavilion, and that was their national debut, and his dad was the caller. And what happened that night at this square dance thing between these students of these 5 schools showed up was really something to behold. We competed the next day. Basically, myself and a student committee, about 12 students, had come up with the events. We had written to the forestry people. We basically stole most of our scoring, our methodology from forestry. There's 13 southern states that have a forestry conclave every year, and they literally go and cheerleaders and camp out and so forth. And the events are amazingly similar. They're more horticultural events today. They were basically design, engineering, and construction events in that first field day. And came down to the last event, and about noon we got a bulletin board, a blackboard, and we put it down out by Ecky's Pond, which is where the headquarters were. And Carl McCord was the scorekeeper. We had to keep it legit, so industry was a scorekeeper. And we parked the school bus down there, and that was his scoring headquarters. And he would come out the door and post the thing. And the last event, Ohio State led Mississippi State by 3 points. I remember Dave Lindorfer was here, and the night before, Dave said, "Now, we don't want to beat these people too bad and hurt their feelings." And I said, "Uh-oh." I kept hands off. Yeah. I didn't help pick the team. I didn't do anything. They didn't practice. I mean, they were so cocky, they just knew they were going to walk away with it. And the last event was a dump truck backing and trailer backing contest with the back wonder blacked out, having to use your West Coast mirrors and so forth. And old K.J. Hager was our entrant. I think the first year you only had 1 entrant, maybe 2 the second year. And Carl would not allow the final results to be known until the banquet that evening. And unknown to everyone, KJ just blew them away. He had a maze course of these red cones, and he backed through, and I think he even touched one. But at any rate, in all the excitement, Carl decided that if the superiority had to be decided one way or the other, it was going to be decided, and he decided on brute force. So he sent Terrell Buckley with Campus Landscape to get one of his tree climbing ropes. And so the tug of war was really just kind of a happenstance to develop. I understand it's still a part of the field day today.
Broke the tension, didn't it?
Yeah.
How many people were at that field day? Do you have any idea? 5 schools, and of course, just for the record now, Michigan State
I have
did not
the records.
show up, did they?
No, Michigan State didn't come. Roy couldn't prevail the student. Melanie Reinhold, she's Melanie Reinhold Soccer today of Reinhold Landscape, decided that she was going to go with the student ski trip to Colorado. And so Michigan didn't show up, but Texas Tech came. By then, Ron Smith had moved to Texas Tech. And Davis Sidner brought Ohio State. And Tom Lead called me and said, "Say, we got a little junior college up here that's got a program. Is it okay if they come?" I said, "Sure. Who are they?" Milwaukee Area Technical Center. And Dave Lindorfer, we had badges with their mascots and their school colors, their ribbons on it. And, David Lindorfer called up there and says, "I've called 2 places and I can't get where the horticulture program is. How many campuses do you all have?" And they said, 5. He said, 5. Says, "How many students do you have?" And they said, 40,000. Had a 2-year technical program. Yeah. Milwaukee Air Technical Center came down, and Jim, right now I can't remember who the other school was, but Georgia sent 2 or 3 people.
Oh, really?
They sure did. Yeah. They were at the first one.
Well, of course, Milwaukee Area Technical College had it last year, and you'd be pleased to know there were 15 schools, universities, technical colleges represented, and close to 600 people in attendance, so it's grown quite a bit in the 11th year. And of course, with that comes some need for polishing things up. So
always room for improvement, isn't it?
That's
in
right.
anything we do.
Yeah.
Well, you asked me about the numbers. The first year, I think we were just over or just under 200, and then the second year it almost doubled. There were 57 industry people here the second year. And it turned into a recruiting fair. The recruiting was just totally a side thing the first year, but industry saw and they got to observe under pressure. I got a real lesson in what industry looked for when they went to recruit. Wally Cox and Fred Rayner were both recruited by Landscape Design and Construction the first year, hard. One of them was hired by them, Wally was. And I later asked Carl McCord why he recruited them. And he said in the tug of war, he noticed that they both had shoes on that wore cleats. Said he'd take any man that could take any advantage he could get, legal or illegal. They were both scholarship football players and first team on the football team, and they were brutes. But at any rate, Wally was a solid B-plus student and did a fantastic job for Carl until he came home to run the family nursery, the family dairy farm over in Helena, Arkansas. The recruiting thing was structured, and we literally ran out of space in the union. We commandeered every room that the placement center had. We turned the union director out of his office and turned it into a recruiting thing. And I think Al Simpson was put in the ladies' room, and they had 3 desks in there, and they recruited. The union said they had never had that many recruiters on campus at one time before.
And it's still that popular. I think this year it was just amazing the number of interviews that were ongoing. So it's still fulfilling that need, although the basic need of the camaraderie and competition among the students.
One youngster showed up the second year and says he was here to compete in the Olympics of landscape contracting.
It's truly what it's become. Did you have any questions that you wanted to address to Bob
Pretty much
before we wrap it up?
Touch base on everything, basic history of the program, how it evolved.
The co-op thing we've skirted lightly over. Maybe let me philosophize just a bit about that.
I wish you would. You had about 4 or 5 minutes.
I ran a co-op program here for 7 years and literally did not understand co-op. I had been the head of the flower shop, as you know, and you worked there as a student worker. And the shop had lost money for 13 years. And we came in and pretty much brushed things clean, and I remember I made Buddy Kaler the sales manager, and
that year.
You were the design manager, and John was something, and any rate, we put in business practices, and it took off and started making money. And I put so much weight on the general manager there that we required they only take 6 hours a course, a semester. And we did a complete fruit basket turnover every semester, which meant we had 3 different sets of students running it in different positions. They may not, they would work there, but they wouldn't work in the same position for 7 years. Well, on our tri-semester system, that meant 21 different sets of people. 4 times, I let the coward in me show, and I would prevail on the general manager to stay over. I mean, you're doing such a good job, and I'm so busy, I don't want to have to train a new general manager this semester. Why don't you stay? Well, in industry, you would expect that to get better and go on and to greater heights. In all 4 cases, it went straight downhill, and I would have to either set them aside. In one case, I had to literally fire the person and put somebody else in. And I realized that co-op played on the student's short attention span. For 1 semester, the student will go with the throttle wide open and pedal to the floor and just burn it up. And then they're ready to go play these games that students play. Lover or intramural sports or fraternity or the other things. And I had been hearing the same thing in co-op without realizing. Students were out in industry, and they'd be writing to me and say, "Prof, I am so bored. If I don't get back to school, I don't know what I'm going to do." And industry's writing me about what a fantastic job they're doing. And then they're back in the classroom, and Ed Martin and other people in the department saying, "Do you know so-and-so is just fantastic this semester? I can't understand what's happening to them." And the students saying to me on the rest, "Bob, if I don't get back to industry, I think I'm going to blow my gourd. I am so tired of this classroom." 3 or 4 months is their attention. And I understood why we have to have spring breaks, why we had to have a Christmas break. Students can't take the pressure at that age for 9 months. Now, when you get mine and your age, our attention span hopefully lengthens a bit. But I understood the philosophy of co-op.
There's great wisdom in that alternating.
Luther Epting saw that we would never meet the need, and he actually called a seminar here of all of the counselors in the high schools of Mississippi. And I don't know whether you were aware of this, but we entertained them with a skit in Dorman Hall, and that's when our real recruiting started, was that he saw that our growth would come through co-op.
And it did.
And it did. And I did not even make any pretense of being objective about it. I said, there's one way that you can get a degree in contracting here. You can stay here and get a degree, but it's just going to be a piece of paper. And that, plus continuing to adhere to the business core and the design input, the horticulture is important. It's what makes us uniquely different as a contractor. But it is not the only thing that we perceived that we did.
Yeah.
The exterior construction, to me, is what makes the job. It's the guts of the job. It's the framework of the job. And the general contractor really doesn't understand the finesse of landscape construction. And the home handyman with a pickup truck and a wheelbarrow can't handle it. There was that void there. Clyde Singletary saw it. Lewis Wise saw it. Bob Chapin saw it. Bob Callaway was just the catalyst that somehow, at some stroke of luck, allowed this thing to come together.
Well, we were glad that you were there at the time. Thank you for being with us, and
Enjoyed it.
we'll do some more of these.